Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're looking at something really fascinating, those so-called silent recessive genes.
Right.
Turns out they might be having a much more noticeable impact than we, well, ever gave them credit for.
Exactly. We've got some really compelling research that's kind of turned some long-held assumptions on their head.
Hmm.
This stems from a recent study highlighted in Neuroscience News, which itself pulls from work in Nature Human Behavior. And it also connects back to some crucial earlier research from Radboud University, published in Nature back in 2014.
Okay, so quite a foundation there.
Yes.
Our mission today, then, is to sort of unpack this, to understand how just carrying one copy of a recessive gene, something we've always thought was, harmless, could actually be subtly influencing things like our health, maybe how far we go in school.
Even our reproductive success.
Yeah.
It really feels like a new way of thinking about how evolution might still be shaping us. It absolutely challenges the traditional genetic playbook in some pretty fundamental ways. For decades, the understanding of recessive genes has been, well, quite simple.
Right, and here's a detail that really makes you sit up and pay attention. This research suggests people carrying recessive disease genes actually show more medical diagnoses over their lifetime, and perhaps surprisingly, have slightly fewer offspring on average.
Yeah, that's the kicker.
It really makes you question what we thought we knew. Okay, let's get into this. What's the classic understanding? How did we think recessive genes worked?
So the classic view, the one you find in textbooks, is that a single copy of a mutated recessive gene is essentially inert, like a spare part you don't use.
Okay.
It only becomes an issue, it only manifests if you inherit that same mutation from both parents.
2 copies.
Exactly. 2 copies, we sometimes call it biallelic. Only then does the condition show up. The carrier, the person with just 1 copy, was thought to be completely unaffected.
Just passing it along, basically. No effect on them.
Pretty much.
But this new research is pointing somewhere else. What first made the researchers at Radboud, Christian Gillison and Han Brunner, start to question this? What was the clue?
Well, their initial sort of puzzle was the number of intellectual disability cases they were seeing, specifically cases caused by inheriting 2 copies of a recessive gene.
Okay.
When they compared that number to intellectual disabilities caused by dominant mutations where just 1 bad copy is enough, the figures for recessive mutations seemed, well, unexpectedly low.
Lower than they expected based on theory.
Exactly. It felt like something wasn't quite adding up. There seemed to be missing pieces.
That's really interesting, a discrepancy like that. So if it wasn't mainly these inherited recessive gene pairs, where did they start thinking these intellectual disability cases were coming from?
And that leads us right to their 2014 Nature paper.
Okay.
In that study, they discovered something pretty significant, that the majority of these intellectual disabilities actually come from spontaneous mutations, brand new changes in the child's genes that weren't inherited from either parent.
Wow. So de novo mutations.
Precisely, de novo mutations. And that was key because it shifted the focus. It wasn't all about inherited recessive genes causing these conditions.
Okay, that makes sense. So if these new spontaneous mutations were the main driver for intellectual disability, that leaves a big question mark over all those single copies of recessive genes we're all carrying, right?
Exactly.
If they aren't causing the big problems directly, are they doing well? Anything at all?
That was the perfect launching point for this more recent work in Nature Human Behavior. They decided, right, let's look at this on a massive scale. They used the UK Biobank.
The biobank. Huge resource.
Huge. Detailed information, genetic and health data from over 300,000 individuals. They wanted to see if carrying these single recessive mutations had any kind of detectable effect across a large population.
300,000 people. That's just an incredible amount of data to sift through. What were some of the first things that jumped out?
Well, one of the first confirmations was just how common these supposedly silent mutations actually are. They found that, on average, each person carries about 2 mutations in any one of around 1,900 different recessive genes.
2 mutations per person on average. Wow, that's a lot of hidden variation.
It really is. Variation we normally don't even consider.
So what were the consequences then of carrying just 1 copy? Because again, the textbook says nothing.
And this is where it gets really, really interesting and starts to push back against that textbook view.
Okay.
The researchers found that when they looked at the whole group of carriers, these individuals actually had a slightly higher number of medical diagnoses throughout their lives compared to non-carriers.
More health issues overall.
Slightly more, yes. And they also saw this trend where carriers as a group tended to have slightly fewer offspring.
Fewer children. So even with just one copy, there seems to be some subtle disadvantage, something playing out at the population level.
That's what it looks like. It's not causing a specific overt disease in the carrier, but maybe it's leaving a faint footprint.
How so?
Well, one way to think about it is maybe carrying that single copy puts a very slight, almost imperceptible extra burden on certain biological systems.
Okay.
Not enough to cause the full-blown condition associated with two copies, but maybe just enough to make that person a tiny bit more susceptible to other health problems over time.
Right. And did this effect change depending on which recessive gene they were looking at? You mentioned intellectual disability earlier.
Yes, and that's where it got even more pronounced. When they specifically focused on carriers of recessive genes known to be linked to intellectual disability, well, the effect seemed amplified.
Bring us back to that original puzzle. What did they find in that specific group? The carriers for intellectual disability genes.
So one particularly surprising finding, I think, was related to education.
Education? How?
Individuals carrying a single recessive gene associated with intellectual disability tended, on average, to have shorter school careers. Yes, suggesting perhaps a lower level of overall educational attainment, which is really unexpected because, again, according to standard genetics, that single copy shouldn't impact their cognitive abilities in any measurable way.
That is a real head-scratcher, isn't it? How could carrying one silent gene potentially influence something as complex as how long you stay in school?
It really forces you to reconsider what silent actually means in this context.
Definitely.
It hints there might be very, very subtle effects perhaps on development, maybe even social interactions that we just haven't picked up on before.
And you said this wasn't the only area. There was also the reproductive success aspect.
That's right. They also noted that trend of reduced reproductive success seems stronger in carriers of these particular genes, the ones related to intellectual disability.
Reduced reproductive success. How did the data actually show that? What did it look like?
The analysis showed that these carriers were statistically more likely to be childless compared to individuals who didn't carry those specific gene variants.
More likely to be childless.
Okay. And this is where the conversation starts moving towards evolutionary forces, and specifically sexual selection.
Right, the bigger picture. Why might this be happening? Let's quickly recap Darwin's ideas here. Natural selection and sexual selection. How do they fit?
Okay, so Darwin, obviously, on the origin of species, gave us natural selection. Organisms with traits better suited to their environment survive and reproduce more successfully. Survival of the fittest, essentially.
The classic idea.
But later, in The Descent of Man, he introduced sexual selection. This is more about the competition for mates.
So it's not just about pure survival, but also about who gets chosen, who gets to pass on their genes through reproduction.
Precisely. An individual might be perfectly fine in terms of survival, but if certain subtle traits, maybe even traits we're not consciously aware of, possibly linked very indirectly to carrying these single gene copies influence mate choice,
Or social standing, maybe?
or social dynamics, exactly, then those genes might just be slightly less likely to make it into the next generation.
So the researchers are suggesting that these extremely subtle, almost invisible effects of carrying one recessive gene for intellectual disability might somehow be influencing mate selection or social outcomes enough to lead to that slightly lower chance of having children.
That's the leading hypothesis they put forward. They are careful to say, more research is definitely needed to prove this link conclusively.
Sure.
But sexual selection offers a plausible explanation for why you'd see this reduced reproductive success, especially when you think about all the complex social and personal factors involved in partnership and starting a family.
It really makes you think about evolution differently. It's not just about big, dramatic genetic diseases having obvious impacts. It can be much subtler.
Absolutely. These findings really underscore that even carrying one copy of a recessive gene can create a tiny, almost imperceptible selection pressure when you look across a whole population.
We've seen hints of this before, right? Like with
Yeah.
sickle cell trait.
Exactly. Sickle cell trait is the classic example. One copy gives some protection against malaria, which is a survival advantage in some regions, even though it carries a small health risk itself, and two copies cause sickle cell anemia. But this new research suggests this kind of subtle selection might be happening much more broadly across many different recessive genes.
And the researchers think this has pretty big implications for how we understand our own genetics, and maybe even the fact that evolution is still well, happening.
They absolutely do. They argue this shows our genes are constantly being shaped, constantly under selection, even now, even with modern medicine. Christian Gillison had a great quote on this. He said, "We will never be optimized for tomorrow's problem."
Hmm, that's powerful.
Isn't it? It highlights that evolution is this continuous adaptive process. We're never finished.
It reminds you we're all just part of this massive ongoing genetic story. And they think this might even mean we need to, like, update the textbooks.
That's their feeling, yes. They believe this evidence showing a subtle disadvantage for carriers, especially for these intellectual disability-linked genes, is significant enough that it should make us reconsider how we teach and understand basic genetic inheritance and these evolutionary forces.
Any specific data point backing that up?
Yeah, they pointed to what they calculated as a threefold reduction in the calculated frequency of biallelic intellectual disability in the population relative to other recessive disorders.
Okay, break that down a bit.
It suggests that the actual rate of intellectual disability caused by inheriting 2 copies of these specific genes is lower than you'd expect compared to other recessive conditions. And the implication is that these subtle selection pressures against carriers are actively weeding out these gene variants over time, more so than for other recessive genes.
Yeah. So evolution in action, subtly shaping our genetic landscape right now.
That seems to be the implication.
Okay, so let's try and wrap this up. If you had to boil it down, what's the main takeaway from this deep dive into this really thought-provoking research?
I think the core message is that carrying just one copy of a recessive gene, particularly those linked to intellectual disability, might not be the completely neutral event we assumed it was.
Not so silent after all.
Not entirely silent, no. These carriers might face very subtle disadvantages, maybe in overall health, perhaps influencing educational paths, and seemingly affecting reproductive success at a population level. It really challenges that simple textbook idea that you need 2 copies for any effect.
It's truly surprising, isn't it, to think these genes we considered silent could actually be having a measurable impact on individuals and potentially on the evolutionary path of our species.
It is surprising, and it really opens up a whole new set of questions.
Like what?
Well, how else might these tiny, seemingly insignificant genetic variations be subtly shaping us, our traits, maybe even broader societal trends, in ways we're only just starting to grasp? And pushing beyond genetics, what other silent factors might be out there, subtly guiding our lives and, well, the future of humanity? Makes you wonder, doesn't it?